If we use ranked choice, more people get a voice. It's not a case of I lose if you win. When we find common ground, we can turn this thing around and somehow solve this mess that we are in. There are always more than 2 points of view.
Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and this is our last Tuesday night show before the election. Obviously, we are recording this before Tuesday because the Breeze Line studio at Southeastern Connecticut's CTV is undergoing renovations. So we're doing this remotely. I'm joined today by 2 Green Party candidates for Registrar of Voters, Doug Lary, who's running in Windham, and Brian Gay, who is running in East Hampton. And they both run for Registrar before. And in addition to talking about their campaigns, I just want us to be able to talk about the roles of registrars and about voting in Connecticut in general. So welcome, Doug. Welcome, Brian. I don't know what order you want to go into, but if each of you would like to introduce yourself and why you put yourself through this.
I don't know.
Youth before beauty?
Oh, hey, sure. Whatever. Sounds good to me. My name's, I'm assuming that means I'll go first, but so my name's Brian Gay. I live in, as Verona said, live in East Hampton, Connecticut. I'm running for Registrar of Voters on the Green Party line in East Hampton. This is my 3rd time running as a 3rd party candidate. I run Green all 3 times. I've been a registered Green since about I think it was 2012. So just about 10 years, I guess, my 10-year anniversary. And I first ran for office in 2018 and then again in 2020 and am running again this year. And just to answer some of the questions that you had mentioned, Verona, so by way of introduction, I have been here in East Hampton since 2015. I moved from my home in Massachusetts originally, where I grew up, and then I went to school in Providence, Rhode Island. And after school, met my partner who's from Connecticut, and we settled here in East Hampton in 2015. And I first ran for office in 2018 after getting involved with the Connecticut Greens when I found out that Registrar of Voters is really such kind of a key office in terms of the political landscape here in Connecticut, both practically speaking in terms of the role that it plays in terms of supervising and helping to manage our elections. Literally the election day process and everything from voter registration to getting the ballots into the box and reporting the results at the end of the night. So they really are the most hands-on kind of elected officials who are dealing with the nuts and bolts of our elections, which was news to me. I really wasn't familiar with the Registrar of Voters position prior to that. And furthermore, what I was surprised to learn was that it's a partisan position, meaning that for each town, there are 2 Registrar of Voters. And by state statute, a registrar is guaranteed for each town to represent each of the 2 major parties. So there's one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans. That being said, it leaves a big void for the 42% of registered voters in Connecticut who don't identify as either a Democrat or Republican. So that really motivated me. I felt like, okay, that's a good use of my, time and my voice is to try and raise awareness about this. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that. So that's what I've been doing the past 3 years, or not past 3 years, but past 3 times. So since 2018 is trying to raise awareness about that and just giving voters another choice on their ballot, because I think that the more voices and choices we have in our elections, the better. So yeah, that's kind of the brief intro to why I'm running and why I have been running since 2018.
Okay, what about you, Doug?
Well, I like that voices and choices line, Brian. I've run twice before. This is also my 3rd time. I ran first in 2012, and when I did so, I intentionally gave voters 3 ways to choose me. I ran on the Green line, I ran on a local ballot access line called the Bottom Line. They tend to support credible candidates in town, regardless of party, especially if their party hasn't quite got it together. And in 2012, that was useful. The Green Party was, getting ready to run candidates, and the Bottom Line was ready. And I also ran as a petitioning candidate. So I ran, choose how you want me to represent you in the election process. Like yourself, I was concerned that a large portion of the voters are not well represented in the Registrar of Voters office. Each major party has a registrar and a deputy, but there's nobody else left intentionally representing the rest, which is larger in most towns than both of the other parties. And in every town, it's larger than some party. So people who are intentionally not affiliating with parties are sending us a message, and we're not responding in the oversight and responsibility and process-oriented job that the Registrar of Voters represents. I helped a candidate in 2009 and stumbled into interest in this when I found out that, gee, in a university town, people move a lot. Gee, in a town where people rent, their addresses are pretty messy. Gee, in a town with 5 post offices, the zip code is really hard to get right. And so as a data-oriented guy from large Fortune 500 companies, I thought, I've got something to offer here. I know large data, and I like accuracy. So I started running for registrar in 2012 after realizing that the data I was getting was hard to keep right. The registrars might be trying in various levels over the years, but there were gaps in the quality. And I thought I could help them with that. And as it turns out, over the years, I did help with that. Early on, I helped Wyndham after the 2010 census with redistricting. They wanted to have polling sites that would be closer for people to walk to, but they needed to know who votes, and is that within walking distance of a large cluster of people, or is everybody going to burn gas and need buses and go places? And so I actually helped the registrars in 2012 as I was running for office. It's not a very competitive race; they win, and I earned my $100 for helping them out. And since then, I've been doing that sort of work with registrars ever since, for 10 years now. I got hired in 2016 as a regional election monitor. It's a new role created in 2015 by Denise Merrill, one of her best moves in office. The concept was originally to have some oversight in problematic towns like Bridgeport and Hartford, and those towns had their own monitor. But in addition to those, town-specific monitors, they created 9 positions statewide in the councils of government, similar to our Connecticut uses councils of governments instead of counties. And so I was originally one of 9 positions that helps registrars, helps make sure their people get trained. And if the Secretary of State gets one of those nasty calls from a voter that says, there's trouble in River City, well, then I get sent to River City. I'm literally at the beck and call of Secretary of State on Election Day. And it's a great role for me. And so I haven't run for registrar since I got that job. I ran in 2012, 2014, and 2016. I got this regional job. It's right for me. I get to act in 16 towns on behalf of the registrars when they need my help, and on behalf of the state when the state thinks the voters need my help. This year, after 3 other candidates having run after me in my town, it was sort of my turn to do it again. The people who were most oriented towards this process geeky role of make the data right had already done it, and we're in, got to get my master's degree and other points in their lives. And so it came to me to run for registrar again, and I'm glad to, because I've come close a couple of times, but I don't expect that I'll ever come close enough. You have to come in second.
And I recall 2012 when you ran on 3 lines, and after that, I don't know if you were the cause of changing the law or not, but you can't do that anymore. Petitioning candidates cannot be on more than 1 line. And so, Brian, I think, pointed out that 42% of the voters aren't Republicans or Democrats, but the message that's coming down from the Secretary of State's office in the legislature is that we're making it harder and harder for these 42% to actually get, representation that they deserve, not easier and easier. So I guess, what kind of response are you getting this year? Has either of you noticed a difference in, when you talk to people about this role compared to past years?
So I can say I haven't noticed a substantial difference in terms of, feedback I'm getting from people. I just went for a walk this evening and ran into someone who I know in town who had seen my letter to the editor that I had written, I think, week before last, kind of just announcing my campaign here in town. And he, thanked me for the letter and said that he had seen it and, appreciated it and was supporting me. So that was great to hear. It's always nice to get feedback like that. But I think one thing that is different this year in East Hampton, which had made the race a little more interesting. So there has been a different Democrat who has run each time that I've run, at least in 2018 and then 2020. However, it's been the same Republican registrar of voters since I first started running in 2018, kind of a longstanding person in that position. And this year, there had been some question as to whether or not she'd be able to run this year, or really whether or not she'd be able to take office, depending on kind of what was going on with her personal situation. And that being said, that was leading to my having a question as to whether or not, just to your point that you had just been mentioning, Rona, about how the multiple lines and not being able to run on multiple lines, because it seemed like maybe the Republicans weren't going to have a candidate, to run for their slot. And so I had been wondering, okay, so I'm running as a Green, I'm running to represent people who don't fit into either party. But now it seems like maybe the Republicans won't even have someone for their slot. So I had to do some investigating as to, okay, well, could I serve in that role as well? Could I help fill in the gap, essentially, and be a person who's there to, if I get elected, help maintain the office, while there's this change in administration. I think, like you were saying, based on the law and not being able to serve on multiple lines, that would be really complicated. But that was an interesting twist to the race this year.
Well, I can add to that a bit. It so much depends on what town you're in. Take a look at Manchester, for instance, where the registrars are seen as managers. They do as little as the law absolutely requires of being a registrar, and they represent their party to make sure that both major parties have an eye on things. And then they hire a bunch of clerical staff to be the professional, get it done on a day-to-day basis folks. Strikes me as a model worth considering. Unlike so many offices I visit, when I visit Manchester, there's always somebody there. There's always somebody who has been doing this for years. I think it was 3 clerks. The point is, there was always somebody who had continuity and was, interested in doing the job, and they weren't necessarily the elected partisan, person. They were a clerk. And I liked that model. In some towns, I see, oh, they're two big registrars and they've picked their deputies, and well, that's all the money we're going to spend. And then it's always a question of, well, who gets that money? The registrars or the deputies, or who does the work? Is it hourly, stipend? It's interesting. But Manchester's example is a little piece of progress towards professionalization of the role. In some towns, we have a problem where there is no deputy. In some towns, we have a problem with there is no second registrar. Union, Sterling, maybe somebody was appointed 2 years ago, but has anybody seen them? And this doesn't meet the needs of the statute that assumed the two major parties would rigorously keep an eye on each other to make sure that they weren't doing anything wrong. I admired Denise Merrill's efforts to at least introduce language that might allow regional approaches if towns changed their charters and wanted to. But nobody thinks of this far enough in advance to change their charter. You lack a second registrar or even both registrars in about June when you're endorsing. And it's hard to pass a charter change in the few weeks before the election. And so Denise made some good moves there. Appreciate her efforts. She was trying to look towards what other states do, where they're working on county scales and larger. And some counties are larger than our entire state, and they're run by one group of professionals. So we have some problems with this, particularly in the northeast corner where I work, but a few other towns. Every now and then we have trouble getting a candidate from the major parties. In Union, it's a struggle to get even one. In Sterling, we typically get one, but the second is often, I'll get there if my job allows it, because for many people, the stipend, the small pay, make it so this is not their priority in life. This is what they do for a couple extra grand a year. And the job gets bigger every year. So this is a problem. We had that problem again in Voluntown. We have trouble with towns that maybe can find a registrar to do this, but can't find them in time to get them on the ballot. This year, Deep River failed to get people on the ballot. Torrington failed. Sterling failed. Union failed. It's not rare anymore. When I first got interested in this, it was like, oh, that's interesting. That's rare. But now, at one point in the midsummer, it looked like we had 18 towns with one or less registrars on the ballot for this summer. And now it looks like it's about 12. And we've been working with other minor parties, trying to see, can anyone find a good candidate to run in Sterling? Can anyone find another good candidate to run in Torrington? So in your case, you're running as a third, Brian. But in many towns, we're struggling to find a second reasonable candidate.
That's what I wanted to clarify, just to make sure I was understanding what you're saying. So you're saying in 12 towns now, a week before the election, there are still ones that don't have even the minimum of
and
2.
They're going to either have a write-in election, which is hard to know about. I'm pretty sure there's one in Torrington and Deep River. I had heard there might be one in Sterling, but there's no public posting of who's eligible to run for write-in, who registered. You can go ask when you go to vote. You can ask your town clerk, but it's not posted anywhere. It's basically a secret if there's anybody running who didn't petition to ballot and wasn't endorsed by a major party. So, we have about a dozen of these cases. We looked around for candidates, and I think we have some in Deep River and Torrington, but I'm not confident we have them in all 12 towns. So there will be some towns which only elect one registrar in November. And then a major party hopefully is still looking for, well, who are they going to appoint? Because if there's a vacancy, they must appoint by state statute. Must, as in, like, the chair ought to step in if you can't find anyone else. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to have only one party looking at the election, because aren't you going to complain a little? But, you know, I mean, we've set up this two-party system. We ought to get a second party there. I mean,
And I actually do have a
theory to
couple
be that second party, but boy, the major parties are failing in a surprising number of towns.
I wonder if that would kind of be a way to help influence the move towards professionalizing this role rather than make it a political appointee. In New London, this is all foreign to me because Registrar really is a political appointee in New London. We don't vote on them. The parties choose them when they do their nominating convention and submit the name, and the registrar appoints a deputy, and we never get a chance to vote. But there are a lot of towns.
Absolutely any choice for a nonpartisan or minor party person to compete with those two.
That is
even when the
true.
Greens, because the Greens had held office, right? Wasn't there a Green on town council or on board of?
Yeah, we've had Green registered on town council, city council, and board of education.
Yeah.
But registrar of voters, because the New London City Charter predates a lot of the state statute, they got themselves grandfathered in, and there are some weird idiosyncrasies in New London that are nowhere else in the state, and that is one of them. But I wanted to share my screen just so some people will see that, oh, wait, that isn't what I meant to do. Of course.
We're seeing Deep River right now.
Yeah. Oh, you're seeing good, because I'm not seeing it. And if you look in Deep River, for registrar, there is no one on the ballot.
Right. So this is a pure write-in race. 3 candidates, no one's on the ballot.
And so even people who want to vote, they don't even know which person on the write-in list is necessarily representing their party, if that's something that's important to them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in Deep River, it's all write-ins for the registrar job. And I'm going to go here to Torrington. And in Torrington, you can see there's only a Democratic candidate on the ballot. And there isn't a Republican. And I believe Don Alexander registered as a write-in for the Green
Yes, he
Party.
did. So he is the available write-in candidate. A Republican is also an available write-in candidate. Neither of them has experience in the job. It's not like the former registrar Republican somehow messed up the paperwork. Mm-hmm. That person's just not running. They're running another person who happened to be on the Republican town committee to run as a write-in, as a, well, the same way we are. We're basically saying, gee, only a Democrat is not appropriate. Let's make sure there are other parties involved.
And Rona, if I may, I just want to make a comment about the write-in part, because like in those 2 examples that you gave, Deep River and then Torrington, how there are no names listed on the ballot. Because this was news to me just in I just recently got certified as an election moderator through a state training, which Doug, thank you for referring me to that program. It was very informative. And I learned all these best kept secrets about our electoral system, which really shouldn't be secrets, but really the average Joe or Josephine or whomever, the average American, I think, doesn't know. I certainly didn't. And one of them was that for the write-in. So whenever there's a blank on the ballot, ahead of time, people can apply to be a write-in candidate. And then there's a whole list which is kept. And Doug, correct me if I'm wrong with any of this, but my understanding was that there's a whole list of the write-in candidates who have applied to be official write-in candidates. Some people will write in Mickey Mouse or, their friend who they think should be in the office. But there's actually a list of people who do an official campaign, like our Green gubernatorial candidate and lieutenant gubernatorial candidate are doing this year. But that list isn't posted anywhere. It's not published prior to the election.
Yep.
You
have to ask to see it.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Which that
I
was news to
actually
me.
always ask at the polls, just so when I vote, just so they know. They used to be posted. I remember it might have been 2008 because the Green Party had Cynthia McKinney was a write-in presidential candidate. And I believe as chair of our Green Party Town Committee, I got a list of all the write-ins in the state mailed to my home, I think. And that was the last year that I remember seeing it. And it used to be posted where you entered your polling station. There was a whole list of write-ins, and they stopped posting it. You have to ask for it.
Yeah, it's now considered inappropriate to post it because, well, one reason might be that some towns did and some towns didn't, and you want it all the same. But for one reason or another, it's now considered inappropriate to post who you could vote for write-in, but you can ask the election moderator at the site where you vote. If you're voting by absentee, you can call the town clerk and press them to reveal what write-ins, if any, are available to you as an absentee voter. I'm an absentee voter this year. I called my town clerk the day after the write-in registration closed. I said, hey, what are my options? Who might I consider? I had a state representative, for instance, who had no competition on the ballot, running against nobody. Like about a quarter of our state representatives and senators have no competition. But there are often write-ins if you care to express a, not that one, please, type of vote, you have to know who the write-ins are. So you have to ask either your town clerk or your leader of the polling site where you vote. And that person is called an election moderator. And thank you for taking the course, Brian. Bravo.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you for suggesting it
The
again.
best bargains we have in the business. You know, for relatively small bucks, you learn a lot. And there are much more expensive courses. This one's the reasonable priced course.
Yeah, I got a lot of bang for my buck, so to speak. You really do learn a lot. But yeah, I was very surprised to learn that about the list of candidates, because I mean, since I turned 18, over a decade ago, I would have had blanks on my ballot. And I know it may vary. I lived in Massachusetts before in Rhode Island, so I don't know what the regulations are there. But I've been in Connecticut since 2015. And had I known that I had an option of people to fill in for those blanks, I would have considered my options and done some research or determined who those other options were, because oftentimes I'm not satisfied with the only one or two options who are listed. So this year I certainly do plan to ask when I go to the polling station so that I can see, who else is available to choose from.
Yeah, even if I like the only candidate who's running, I'm not content with a process that encourages a second person not to run. Our campaigns are so expensive, so I must win or it's not worth running. I'm disappointed in that approach. You and I are running in races where it's relatively unlikely that we will win, but we have the opportunity given to us by the First Amendment to speak. And I think that's a great way to do it, to say, I am willing to serve in this role. I'm interested in this role. Here's what I think. I think that's one of the better things the Constitution gave us.
That'll solve it. Yeah, and I appreciate about Connecticut, since moving here, like I said, I lived in Massachusetts previously. And Massachusetts is, for all intents and purposes, a one-party state. I know they have a Republican governor, from time to time, but otherwise it's primarily Democratic. And if you look at the races there, it's, oftentimes for a lot of races, there's no opposition. So you have only one choice on the ballot, and whoever that person is who's running for office, they run unopposed, which I think, for me, I find problematic in terms of just, a functioning democracy or having, the whole point of democracy is to have choices and to be able to choose who you want. And when there's only one choice, that's not really a choice. And I think in Connecticut, it's somewhat better than what I saw in Massachusetts, in that we do have more choices on the ballot, which is good for some races at least. However, even then, for example, for this election, you'll see we may have 6 different choices: Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, the Green, and then Independent and Working Families. But when you have that many choices and then the same name is on, 4 out of 6 of those, or, a majority of them, I don't really think that's a choice. I think that's kind of redundant and not what it's intended for. So I would like to see more actual choices on there, aside from just one person taking, 75% of the ballot lines.
Well, one of the purposes of campaigns, I think, should be to educate the public and have the public educate the candidates about what issues are important. And if you have unopposed races, you're just not going to have any opportunity for that dialogue at all. In New London, I feel bad this year. We're not running someone for state rep. We couldn't find someone. Someone said, well, could we cross-endorse the Democrat? And for one thing, he isn't that good. I mean, he'd have to be really, really good for us to consider it. But part of it was, it's like, we can get a local line back pretty easily. It's like 30 to 40 signatures. But if you cross-endorse someone, you're not adding another voice to that conversation. And so it might be nice to have a name on the line, but if you're not adding a voice as well as, a redundant name, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of point to it.
And then even when you get that line, that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone will hear your voice, as we've seen this year, because you may very well meet the legal requirement to be a choice on the ballot, so voters can choose you. But then it's as if you don't exist, because you don't get invited to the debates when they have them. You don't get covered in the media necessarily. So it's kind of like, okay, you've done all I think a lot of voters, I didn't understand until I got involved in, with the local Greens and kind of in this process and having run for office myself, but that there's all these loopholes that you have to jump through and thresholds you have to meet just to get onto the ballot, just to be able to make it on there is, at least for non-major party candidates, is a process. And we're fortunate as a minor party as Greens because we have some access. So it's not like we're brand new, but it also depends on what office you're running for. But for example, when I ran for office initially in 2018, I had to follow up with the Secretary of State's office because they initially denied my petition because they said I had insufficient signatures, and I had to educate the Secretary of State's office or the staff there about what the statute was, because I actually had met the requirement and they didn't realize that or didn't do the math correctly. And so then by pushing back and kind of appealing it, I was able to get on the ballot. So that's a lot of work to be done. And then once you even get on there, to not be included in the conversation or the public discourse is really not fair to voters, I don't think, because, the average voter doesn't know a lot of this information. I still know only a little bit of the big picture, so to speak, and I've been involved in this for some time. So I think it's really an injustice to voters who really don't have access to this information because people don't talk about it, and people who have the platforms don't talk about it because it quite frankly, is advantageous to them for people not to understand that.
I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective on this multiple line cross endorsement stuff. I've run on multiple lines, and so I'll claim perspective. My sense is that voters benefit from having cross-endorsed candidates instead of no candidates. I also would prefer that if there are 6 parties on the ballot, well, that we have 5 or 6 or so candidates. But it's hard to find candidates. These jobs don't pay well. There's physical threats and violence and egads. There are only so many people willing to take this on. And I like it when multiple parties endorse the same person. I like it more than some other options. For instance, this year, a party that had run a gubernatorial candidate before, the Gabriel Oz for Connecticut party, had the ballot line. They could try to find a new mysterious candidate, maybe Frank Monte Frank, I'm sorry, who might run for governor. But they instead decided to pressure the governor candidates and some legislative candidates for, do you support the same things we do? We are looking to endorse somebody who holds these things valuable. The Green Party hasn't done it often, but now and then we very rarely have cross-endorsed somebody who we think is our ally. And so I like to look at those cross-endorsements as not just a rubber stamp. I'd certainly like to hope they aren't just that, but instead this group of voters with this set of views thinks this guy is more tolerable than anything else they could find. Not necessarily better than your guy, but it's the best we could find. And so the Oz Party basically did that this year, and they said, we're going to cross-endorse these people, several, as it turns out, senators, assembly members, and the governor, because they supported ranked choice voting.
Some of them lied, though, about supporting ranked choice voting. I'm convinced that Ned Lamont has no interest at all in ranked choice voting.
The pressure here is to hold his feet to the darn fire, and voting for him as a Democrat will make him think that anything's okay. Voting for him as on the working families line may convince him that, oh, you belong to a union and everything's fine. Voting for him on the Oz line is daring. It would keep that party able to put up another candidate next time, which is a little bit edgy, for Ned. And it would also remind Ned and other Democrats that here's this identifiable block of voters who listen to this third party's concept of, we're going to support people who support ranked choice voting. So, our party didn't go that far. It wasn't able to, by some obscure regulations, to do that. But their party was strong enough to do that, and they did. And I think that's interesting. I doubt many voters understand that that's why there are multiple lines for the same candidate. But the Oz Party went out on a limb and supported Ned because he was willing to say he supported ranked choice voting. And I think that puts them in a really good spot to 4 years from now hold his feet to the fire and say, did you?
We'll see how it shakes out.
You or I might run there to say, somebody should have.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about that. So because I was curious when they endorsed him. I mean, I was glad to see the news about ranked choice voting and actually got people talking about ranked choice voting because, again, that's something I think a lot of people aren't familiar with. We use it internally, as screens, so that's the first time I had exposure to it. And then it's now in Maine. So I volunteered on a race in Maine 2 years ago in 2020, a Senate race there. So I learned a lot about ranked choice voting then. But I think that a lot of voters don't know about it. So I think that did really highlight the issue, which I think was great. And probably caused people to look up, oh, what is ranked choice voting? Oh, it's when you can rank the number, if you have a 5-way race, rank them 1 through 5 rather than just choosing one person. And if your preferred candidate doesn't win, then your vote automatically gets reassigned to your next choice and so on until there's a winner, which is a concept that's so really normal for other circumstances. Like if you go out to eat or if you go to an ice cream parlor and they have however many, 50 plus flavors. You go and you say, oh, well, I want chocolate. Oh, you don't have chocolate? Okay, well, then I'll have vanilla. Oh, you don't have vanilla? Okay, I'll have strawberry. And you do that mentally before you go, and, you're ready for that. So why don't we have options like that for voting? But what I was curious about for the race was when the Oz-Grebo party endorsed him. Now, could they have chosen to endorse one of the minor party candidates as well? For example, we had a gubernatorial candidate who ran, but we didn't meet the threshold for signatures to petition to get onto the ballot.
Well, they could have just nominated our candidate. Michelle interviewed with them.
Oh,
and
really?
They chose Lamont instead.
See,
so I'm a little. Full disclosure, the term I served on the New London Board of Education, my candidacy was cross-endorsed by the city Republicans. And Myrna served 3 terms on the Board of Ed, and the first 2 terms she was cross-endorsed by the Republicans. By her 3rd term, she had enough name recognition in town that she could get on the board only on the Green Line. So I kind of see it as a scaffolding thing sometimes, like, for someone new who doesn't have the name recognition, the cross endorsement is helpful. But in Lamont's case, since the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State places a very low priority on ranked choice voting, I actually just think he lied. He might feel like he has to pay the piper in 4 years, or he might figure in 4 years he's not going to run again, and so there won't be consequences. So I'm not against cross-endorsing. I just think, sometimes you have to think about it one case at a time. And since you mentioned ranked choice voting, I do have a slide with these PowerPoints that kind of shows how ranked choice voting works, how you rank your candidates in order, and then how the counting works, that the low person on the, in the choices get their votes redistributed. And I know there are some logistical challenges that it presents. I know Luther Weeks is concerned about ranked choice voting if you started statewide, because you'd have to centralize tallying and ensuring the integrity of the chain of custody of ballots is a little harder than if you're just doing each polling place separately. There are some details that would have to work out. Our current ballot wouldn't really work on it, but work for it. But in primaries, it could work very well since we don't have a grid for primaries. And I think a lot of the Republicans, after Stefanowski got the nomination 4 years ago, there were a lot of mainstream Republicans who were, at least for a short time, considering ranked choice voting. I'm going to choose one more, and this is just a sample ballot that was distributed in Maine 4 years ago for their gubernatorial primary. So, and I just wanted to mention that when we go out of this show for the outgoing credits, Hugh Birdsall, who is running for state rep in the 35th district, who is a musician, has written a song about ranked choice voting. So during this election season, we've been using Hugh's ranked choice voting song at the beginning and the end of our shows.
I think that's awesome.
It's a great ditty. Another point on cross endorsements, minor parties are pressured to cross endorse major parties. Look at the Working Families Party, for instance. They now and then will run a candidate of their own because that's how you get a new spot on the ballot. But for the rest of time, they'll always be pressured to cross endorse a winner, somebody who's guaranteed to get more than 1%, because that keeps their slot that they might someday find another candidate for.
Mm.
And so we have these rough spots in how we get on a ballot, how we stay on a ballot, and they can sometimes influence, corrupt, affect the process of who gets cross-endorsed and why. You know, are the working families thinking that Ned Lamont is the best unionist ever? Well, not necessarily.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it is a balancing act with cross endorsement to keep both the ballot slot and your leverage. And it's not an easy, it's not easy to keep both at the same time.
What I appreciate about the Greens is that we at least run, unlike some of the other parties who may only cross-endorse every single election, to infinity. We actually run our own candidates, which I think is, I appreciate that about the Greens. I
do too. And we very rarely cross-endorse. We have done it in New London once. It was a state rep candidate who had actively supported Green Party candidates for local office, to the point that he let us put his picture on our literature for municipal elections while he was serving as a Democrat in the legislature. And that is quite rare. And we didn't have a candidate, and we thought, it would not be a bad thing to kind of thank him for being supportive, having events that supported minor party candidates while he was serving as a Democrat. So, sometimes you do it, but I do think you need to be careful about it. I do have, we have about 10 minutes, and I wanted to share a ballot, a couple of ballots, but we'll start with, I'm going to go, okay, that's Wolcott. That's where Sherry Conroy is running as registrar. Oh, yeah, there isn't one in that one. Keith Foster is running.
I turned them off.
Keith Foster is running in Essex, and here is East Hampton, and you can see Brian's name in column 11 on row G, and then here is the one for Wyndham with Doug's name in column 11. And all these ballots also have a ballot question. And I think that since this show was largely election related, it's an election related question about enabling the General Assembly to provide for early voting. And does either of you want to talk a little bit about the early voting issue?
I can address that a little bit while Brian develops a rebuttal. There are pluses and minuses. One of the problems in Connecticut is that our Constitution told us there was one day, and most states have many. And politicians want us to have many. And people's lives and careers and elder care and child care responsibilities make it very hard to have an election on one day. So gradually we've fiddled with the absentee ballot as a way to get a little more flexibility. During COVID, a court case said, well, you can be concerned about sickness in the community and claim that as a reason to use an absentee ballot. And so we essentially have this sort of fuzzy early voting through an absentee ballot that says, sickness, I'm worried about it. How about you? But early voting in most states means that you go in person to a regional site and an electronic screen. You can pick a ballot from any of 100 towns. Well, we use paper ballots, which I vastly prefer, which would be hard to how many ballots you're going to put in a centralized location. If we go with town by town, in-person paper ballots ahead of time, Connecticut's system of running elections town by town will be heavily challenged. Eastford has 4 hours a month allocated to their registrars to run election services. 4 hours a month. It's not legal. You can't possibly do the job in 4 hours, but that's all they've budgeted for. Other towns don't have town clerks or registrars or even the town hall available every day. So if you said, oh, there are 5 days of early voting, well, which 5 days? Will it be different in different towns? Will you be able to find staff that can do that and hold their full-time jobs elsewhere if they're working for low pay in a teeny town a couple of hours a month? So Connecticut has some unusual troubles. So this question on our ballot isn't, let's do this exact method for early voting. It's instead an invitation for, is it worthwhile setting up a study committee so that the legislature can hear all the little towns say, are you blooming crazy? Or all the big towns say, yeah, sure, no problem, let's do it. Because they have totally different staffing. You know, go to Scotland, go to Union. They're not open every day. And if you, just because you say so in Hartford doesn't mean they get a second registrar or the money or open the darn doors. So this is only a permission to explore question. I recommend passing it, but we should understand that doesn't mean it's going to happen in like the next election. Money's got to move, people got to move, minds have to change.
Yeah, and I think just kind of going off of what Doug was saying, I personally, I'm in favor of anything that expands voting access so that whoever is qualified to vote and is able to vote, that it's as easy as possible for them to vote. I think that the way we currently do things, it's not always that easy for people, especially since we don't have, you know, an election day holiday. People have to work on election day oftentimes. Sometimes it's very challenging for them to be able to get to the polls on election day. They may qualify for an absentee ballot in some circumstances, but do they know how to, you know, navigate that process? So I think that early voting would help to expand the period of time during which people can cast a vote securely. And I think that I'm not opposed to that, but I think that there are other things to consider as well. Such as it had been brought up when I was having a conversation with some people about this previously, that oftentimes in an election, towards the tail end of an election, as you're approaching election day, campaigns will start to release bombshell information essentially about their opponents to try and sway the vote, and sometimes hold on to information until the last minute to try and get an advantage, you know, right before the election. That's, you know, not great for voters if they have the information beforehand. You know, they should be transparent and share it so people know. But that being said, if you cast your vote early and then something drastically changes, okay, now you want to change your vote. What happens in that case? If there's some, you know, drastic information that becomes publicly available, it really would have significantly changed how people voted. One thing that I have heard is used in other countries is called a silence period. I don't know a lot about that, but essentially it's that we'd have to have more control essentially of political advertising and what campaign ads are happening. And that goes to the money in politics issue as well, and campaign finance, which is a much larger issue. But I think those are just things people have to consider, that, like you said, Doug, it's not a fix-all. It's not gonna magically fix the system. I think if it expands access and can maintain, while we're maintaining election integrity, then that's great. But we need to look at it as part of a big picture too.
Yeah, I'm recommending a vote for this, hoping that it gets discussion and committee consideration, study groups, brings out voters from small towns who will say, who's going to fund this? You know, my town's barely surviving now. You want to have 2 extra days of voting, or did I hear 30? You know, everybody's talking different money here. You're talking Scotland, things are very different than, say, Glastonbury. So I think it's ripe for discussion, just as ranked choice voting should be. But let's not rush to one particular solution until lots of voices have been heard.
And I agree. I think that, yeah, doing a study is great, and it would be a way to get feedback and consider all of these, intricacies of the, the proposal, provided that it doesn't just become a study group and then they shelf it and continuously shelf it and don't do anything with it. But I think if they really take it, seriously and really do justice by that, study, then I think that would be great. So in that case, I would support a vote in favor of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, yeah, I agree that anything with the potential of increasing access to voting is not half of the solution to our voting election problems, but it's a piece of it. I also would love to see a question someday or action someday about making candidate running access also a little easier, because, you can have everyone able to vote conveniently and no choices for them to, consider when they're at the polls.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're kind of in the last minute or so. Does each of you want to just talk for about a minute about, election day coming up and what your plans are for the next week?
Brian?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. So, so we are a week away from election day. So I am hoping to continue to amplify the voices of my fellow candidates who are running for office as Greens here in the state. I loved that voter guide that the party had published showing who everyone can vote for so that they can vote Green if they want to vote Green. For people who are watching this who may not have watched other episodes, I think knowing that you can write in, we were talking about writing candidates, you can write in for governor and lieutenant governor by writing the letters M as in Michelle, L as in Louise, B as in Bicking. That's our gubernatorial candidate. Plus, the plus sign, C as in Cassandra, A as in Apple. I don't know what her middle name is. I think it's
Adelina.
Oh, okay.
But it's not in the printed material because it just makes her name way too long.
Yeah. So, but A, and then M is in Martineau, and that's our lieutenant governor candidate. And so MLB plus CAM, and that would be a vote for the Green line for governor if you'd like to do that, if you're not interested in the other candidates. And yeah, I'd encourage people to investigate and learn about all the candidates who are going to be on the ballot. So that you can make an informed decision when you go in on next Tuesday, November 8th. And yeah, I would just also encourage people to get involved, continue to pay attention. It can be very overwhelming. I know that myself, as someone who is, moderately well involved in this process and the intricacies of it, it's still a lot to understand. So, but that being said, it's worth getting to know, and the more you learn, the easier it becomes. So I just really encourage people to brush up on your civics, and I find the Greens are a great resource for doing that. So they've been helpful for me. I think will be helpful for others as well.
And I'm working with the towns that I help support in the election process. As we get closer and closer to the election, my role as a Green diminishes and my role as an election official for the state increases. Much like the other election workers, the registrars have the same challenge. As we get closer and closer to the election in a state where the elections are run by partisans, for partisans, we each get driven a little closer to the original objective of working for the process. And in this week, I am at the beck and call of 16 towns. And on election day, I typically have a 25-hour day. I have to be available as they open up and have trouble, and I have to be available as they try to get the results in at the end of the night and start having ordinary technical computer troubles. So I'm glad I've got, deep background in computers, because election day becomes, it may start as people, but it becomes computers by the end of the night.
I bet it does. And my last remark will be just to remind people that for the Registrar of Voters race in particular, voting for a Green or other non-R, non-D candidate doesn't make the Republicans or Democrats lose. They win. They'll get in office, whatever. And the benefit of voting for someone who isn't one of the major parties, is to get an added voice and to get the added representation for all of our voters who are not members of those parties. So you're not really taking the vote away from the parties who are guaranteed to have a space in the registrar's office. So thank you both for joining me. And, next week, I'm not sure who will be on, but, the show will air at the end of voting on Tuesday. So this will be our last pre-election show, and we'll see you all at the polls. And thank you to Brian and Doug.
Thank you, Rona.
Thank you.
If we use ranked choice, more people get a voice. It's not a case of I lose if you win. When we find common ground, we can turn this thing around and somehow solve this mess that we are in. There are always more than 2 points of view. If you listen, you'll find out that it's true.